Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. In this case, we are going to dive into the very tragic case of James Holmes, the man behind the mass shooting in Aurora, Colorado at the movie theater back in 2012. On the night of July 20th, Holmes opened fire during the screening of The Dark Knight Rises, killing 12 people, injuring 70 others, in an act of unimaginable horror. But as devastating as this event was, the story behind James Holmes is even more complicated than it may first appear. Holmes had a history of mental illness, and his defense team argued that he was legally insane at the time of the massacre. Yet the prosecution insisted that his meticulous planning proved otherwise, that he knew exactly what he was doing. This case raises the unsettling question: was James Holmes driven to commit this atrocity by his mental health issues, or was this a cold, calculated act of evil? As we unravel the details of this case, we'll look beyond the headlines to explore the life of James Holmes, his mental health struggles, his home life, and what was really going on with him leading up to that fateful night. While many focus on the weapon used, we are going to take a deeper look at what may have been the true source of this tragedy. Guns do not shoot themselves. Stay with me as we uncover the disturbing truth behind the Aurora theater shooting and ask what really went wrong in the mind of James Holmes. James Holmes wasn't a criminal mastermind with a long history of violence, nor was he someone who had flown under the radar. Before July 20th in 2012, Holmes had lived a relatively quiet, unremarkable life. But behind that exterior was a deeply troubled individual. So what went wrong? And more importantly, was his mental illness the driving force behind his actions, or was there something more? By all accounts, James Holmes struggled with severe mental health issues long before the Aurora shooting. His academic performance had started to decline, and he eventually dropped out of a neuroscience PhD program at the University of Colorado. It was during this time that his mental health deteriorated rapidly. He became isolated, withdrew from friends and family, and started exhibiting disturbing behavior. Holmes had reportedly been seeing a psychiatrist at the university, Dr. Lynn Fenton, and had even discussed his violent fantasies with her. In fact, months before the shooting, Holmes sent a notebook to Fenton in which he described in chilling detail his thoughts of killing others. This raised a haunting question: how was someone with such clear signs of mental distress able to carry out such a meticulously planned massacre? Holmes' defense argued that he was in the throes of a psychotic episode at the time of the shooting, and they described how his mental health had unraveled over time, pointing to his diagnosis of schizophrenia and other serious conditions. His defense team contended that Holmes was legally insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong when he entered that theater and opened fire on innocent moviegoers. One of the more troubling aspects of Holmes' case is his history with prescription meds. There are reports that Holmes had been prescribed antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs during his treatment. But did these medications help or worsen his condition, and were they even effective in treating the extent of his mental illness? The exact impact of his medication regimen remains unclear, but it's a critical point in understanding Holmes' mental state. He was deeply troubled, but the question becomes, did the treatment he was receiving fail him, or was he already too far gone by the time he sought help? This raises another important issue: how mental health care systems handle individuals at risk of violence. Dr. Fenton had reportedly warned the university about Holmes' erratic behavior, but there was no formal intervention. It's easy to look back and wonder if more could have been done to prevent the tragedy. We do this with every tragedy, right? We look back, what could have been done. But the reality is that the mental health systems are often overburdened and they're unprepared to handle such extreme cases. James Holmes wasn't a drifter. He wasn't someone who had been estranged from society. He grew up in a seemingly stable, middle-class family in California. His parents, Robert and Arlene Holmes, they were educated professionals. His father was a scientist. His mother was a nurse. Did you know this? They weren't oblivious to their son's struggles either, but the extent of what they knew about his deteriorating mental state, it remains a matter of debate. According to reports, the Holmes family was aware that James had experienced mental health issues during his adolescence and even early adulthood, but they had no idea he was planning a mass killing. How could they know this? After the shooting, Holmes' parents expressed deep sorrow for the victims and their families, but they also stood by their son, insisting he was mentally ill. He needed treatment, not punishment. This leads to another question. What role did the family play in Holmes' life leading up to the shooting? Did they try to intervene? Were they aware of the severity of his condition? While the public often focuses on the individual, we're always looking at the individual and we're always looking at the weapon. We don't have anything else to really look at. But it is important to consider the support systems or lack thereof around people like Holmes. The media talks about the weapon and the person committing the crime, but how many times do we really get the full background of how this even came to be? I mean, was there an opportunity for someone to step in before it was too late? One of the most perplexing aspects of the James Holmes case was the sheer detail and preparation that he put into the attack. Holmes had no criminal record, yet in the months leading up to the massacre, he acquired a significant arsenal of weapons and ammunition. He rigged his apartment with explosives. He even set traps for police officers who would eventually respond to his home. He bought gas masks, body armor, and tear gas canisters, preparing for what seemed like a calculated, deliberate massacre. This level of planning raised serious questions during the trial. If Holmes was mentally unstable, as his defense claimed, if he was as unstable, how could he have carried out such an organized attack? Prosecutors argued that Holmes knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to his actions after the shooting, including his calm surrender to police, as evidence that Holmes was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. So, here's the key question that we're left with. Was Holmes a deeply disturbed individual whose mental illness drove him to commit mass murder? Or was this a case of cold, calculated evil? His defense team argued that he was experiencing a psychotic break and had lost touch with reality, while the prosecution insisted he was fully aware of what he was doing, driven by dark, violent fantasies. And there's always that question of, they're mentally disturbed, yet they planned. Can mentally disturbed people plan anything? I mean, that seems to be a real big point in these cases. If they're mentally disturbed, then they shouldn't be able to plan. And if they plan, then they knew what they were doing. It's a tricky question. Let's take a look at the facts, the timeline of events, the shooting, the aftermath. To fully understand how James Holmes ended up committing one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern U.S. history, we need to look at the months leading up to the tragedy, his actions on the day of the shooting, and the consequences that followed. James Holmes was not someone who appeared dangerous to the outside world in the years before the shooting. Born in 1987, Holmes grew up in a middle-class family in San Diego. Academically, he was gifted. He showed promise from a young age, excelling in science and eventually enrolling in a prestigious neuroscience PhD program at the University of Colorado. However, by early 2012, things began to change. Holmes' grades started to slip, and his interactions with classmates and professors became increasingly strained. He grew more withdrawn, avoiding social contact and spending most of his time alone in his apartment. This was a time when his mental health seemed to unravel. He struggled with severe anxiety and depression, and according to later court testimony, he began experiencing paranoid delusions and violent thoughts. Holmes sought help, meeting with Dr. Lynn Fenton. This is a good thing. Dr. Lynn Fenton, a psychiatrist at the university, but Holmes' condition worsened despite this treatment. By 2012, Holmes withdrew from the PhD program altogether, citing academic failure and emotional instability. It was during this period that he began plotting the attack on the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. In the weeks leading up to this shooting, Holmes meticulously prepared for what would become one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. He ordered a large quantity of ammunition online. He purchased several firearms, including an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, 2 Glock pistols, and a 12-gauge shotgun. He also purchased body armor, gas masks, and tear gas canisters. All of these purchases were made legally, by the way. He had every right to get those items. What disturbed investigators and prosecutors alike, though, was the level of detail and foresight Holmes put into his preparations. And where was the background check on the mental help he had received, any prescriptions he had gotten, any diagnoses? This guy set up elaborate booby traps in his own apartment, rigging it with explosives designed to kill or injure anyone who entered after the shooting. This could have been his family. Fortunately, the traps were discovered and disarmed before anyone was harmed, by trained professionals, of course. On the night of July 20th in 2012, Holmes walked into Theater 9 of the Century 16 multiplex in Aurora during a packed midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises. He was dressed head to toe in tactical gear, including a helmet, gas mask, and bulletproof vest. Shortly after the movie began, Holmes threw 2 tear gas canisters into the crowd, and then he opened fire. The chaos that followed was unimaginable as moviegoers scrambled to escape. Holmes fired indiscriminately into the crowd. 12 people were killed, including a 6-year-old girl, and 70 others injured, some critically. Survivors described the scene as pure terror. People screaming, trying to hide under their seats, and running for the exits as Holmes continued his deadly rampage. Police arrived on the scene within minutes, and Holmes was arrested without resistance in the parking lot outside of the theater. He later told authorities he had booby-trapped his apartment, hoping to divert police resources away from the theater. It was clear that this was not a spontaneous act. It was planned. It was deliberate. It was an attack. The Aurora Theater shooting sent shockwaves through the nation. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history at the time, and the public was left grappling with the horror of what had happened. Vigils were held for the victims, and survivors recounted the terror they had experienced that night. In the days that followed, media attention focused on James Holmes, and details of his life began to emerge. Reporters dug into his background, revealing a young man who had once seemed destined for success, but who had descended into mental illness and isolation. The notebook Holmes had sent Dr. Fenton, filled with violent fantasies and details planned for the shooting, became a focal point of the investigation. Holmes' parents, Robert and Arlene, issued a statement expressing their grief and their sympathy for the victims, while also standing by their son, asserting he was mentally ill. He needed treatment, not execution. James Holmes was charged with 24 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts for each person killed, as well as 140 counts of attempted murder for those who were injured. From the beginning, his defense team pursued an insanity plea, arguing that Holmes was suffering from severe schizophrenia and that his actions were the result of a psychotic break. They argued that Holmes was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the shooting and therefore could not be held legally responsible for the crime. Prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that the level of planning and preparation Holmes put into this attack was proof that he knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed out that Holmes had purchased the weapons, rigged his apartment with explosives, and chosen a crowded movie theater specifically to maximize the number of casualties. In their view, this was premeditated mass murder, carried out by someone fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Trial began in April of 2015, and it lasted several months. During the trial, mental health experts for both the defense and prosecution testified about Holmes' mental state. The defense insisted he was insane, while the prosecution argued that while Holmes may have been mentally ill, he was still capable of understanding that what he was doing was wrong. One of the lingering questions in the James Holmes case is whether more could have been done to prevent this from happening. Holmes had been in treatment with Dr. Fenton and had expressed violent thoughts in the months leading up to this attack. He'd also displayed clear signs of mental distress, yet no formal intervention was made. Some critics argue that the mental health system failed Holmes, while others believe his violent tendencies were beyond the scope of what treatment could have addressed. This case also reignited debates about how mental illness is treated in the United States and whether the country's mental health care infrastructure is equipped to handle individuals like Holmes. While his defense team argued that he was a victim of untreated mental illness, the prosecution made it clear that mental illness alone could not excuse such a heinous crime. Let's take a look at the facts. This is really one of those hard cases to look at. But to fully understand how James Holmes ended up committing one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern U.S. history, we need to examine the months leading up to this tragedy, his actions on the day of the shooting, and the consequences that followed. James Holmes was born in 1987, like I said, in San Diego to Robert and Arlene. He grew up in a middle-class family, his parents both well-educated and successful. Holmes was described as a bright and quiet child who showed significant academic potential from a young age. He excelled in science and math and was known to be socially awkward but intelligent. Despite his promising start, Holmes' struggles with mental health began to emerge in adolescence. He had difficulty connecting to his peers and was described as shy, introverted, and somewhat withdrawn. Though he succeeded academically, his parents later reported that Holmes had experienced mental health issues as a teenager, though the extent of these struggles wasn't fully understood at the time. After graduating high school, Holmes went on to study neuroscience at the University of California, Riverside, where he continued to perform well academically. He graduated in 2010 with a degree in neuroscience and later enrolled in a prestigious PhD program in neuroscience at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. This is a big deal. By early 2012, Holmes began to unravel, though. And although he had entered the PhD program with high hopes, his performance started to decline and he struggled to keep up with the demanding coursework. Classmates described him as increasingly withdrawn and isolated, and his interactions with professors became strained. Holmes, who had once been a promising student, began to exhibit signs of severe mental illness. And at this point, that's when he seeks the help of Dr. Lynn Fenton. She's a psychiatrist at the university. So he's disclosing these violent fantasies and disturbing thoughts, including his desire to kill people. And he had been prescribed antidepressants and antipsychotic meds, but it was unclear whether he was consistently taking them. Dr. Fenton later testified that she had significant concerns about Holmes' mental health, but she didn't have enough information to justify any further intervention. By June of 2012, Holmes' behavior had become even more erratic. He drops out of the PhD program, citing academic and emotional struggles, and then he retreats into complete isolation. And during this time, his planning for the Aurora movie theater shooting began in earnest. He spent weeks meticulously preparing for the attack. He legally purchased multiple firearms, like I said. Perhaps even more disturbing was Holmes' decision to booby-trap his own apartment, though. He rigs the residence with explosive, intending to kill or injure anyone who entered after he left for the theater. Holmes later told investigators that he had hoped to divert police resources to his apartment while he carried out the attack, buying himself more time to kill. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Holmes' preparations for the massacre were alarmingly detailed. Investigators found a notebook that Holmes had mailed Dr. Fenton, which described his plan for the shooting in detail. He wrote about his desire to kill and included drawings of the theater layout, noting where he would enter and where he planned to open fire. On the night of July 20th in 2012, James Holmes entered Theater 9 of the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Dressed in his tactical gear, his helmet, gas mask, bulletproof vest, he calmly walks in, armed with his assault rifle, shotguns, and pistols. And as the movie played, he tossed 2 tear gas canisters into the crowd. He begins firing. He fired over 70 rounds during the attack, and he stopped only when his rifle jammed. Holmes was arrested just outside the theater. He was standing next to his car in his parking lot. He surrendered. He told officers he'd rigged his apartment, and when police got there, they found all of his traps. The news of the shooting spread rapidly across the country. Within hours, the Aurora Theater massacre became the focus of national media attention. Vigils held for victims. Public was in outrage. Grief pouring from all corners. James Holmes was charged with 24 counts of first-degree murder, 140 counts of attempted murder, among other things. His defense team immediately pursues the insanity defense, arguing he was in the midst of a psychotic episode. Prosecutors argue that the sheer level of planning that went into this attack indicated premeditation. In July of 2015, after months of testimony and expert analysis, the jury finds Holmes guilty on all accounts. Now, although the prosecution sought the death penalty, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision during the sentencing phase, and as a result, Holmes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And this leads us to the mental health debate here. Could this shooting have been prevented? One of the most pressing questions that emerged in the aftermath of all of this tragedy was whether more could have been done to prevent any of this from happening. This was a massacre. Holmes had shown clear signs of mental instability in the months leading up to the attack, and his psychiatrist had been aware of these violent thoughts. Yet despite this, no formal intervention took place. Critics of the mental health system argue that Holmes' case is an example of systemic failure, a situation where warning signs were present, but the resources and infrastructure needed to address this mental illness were insufficient. Others contended that given the depths of his psychosis, there may have been no way to act at all. This case also renewed national debates about how the U.S. in particular handles mental illness in the context of violent crime. Holmes' defense team argued that his untreated mental illness was the primary factor behind the shooting, while prosecutors maintained that mental illness could not excuse such a premeditated and calculated act of violence. Let's look at the arguments presented, because like all cases we put here in this podcast, this trial was not just about determining whether he was guilty of this mass shooting. It was about deciding his state of mind during the attack, something that seems almost impossible to do at times. I mean, was he in the midst of a psychotic break? How can we tell? How do we know? Was he unable to understand the consequences of his actions? Or was it just a case of cold, calculated premeditation and he knowingly planned and carried out a massacre? Both the defense and prosecution presented very different narratives. Each side called upon experts in psychiatry, forensic evidence, and criminal behavior to argue their version of the truth. And in the end, the jury had to weigh two very different views and takes on James Holmes. From the very beginning, James Holmes' defense team centered their case around legal insanity. They argued that Holmes was suffering from severe schizophrenia and that his perception of reality was so distorted that he could not be held responsible for his actions. According to the defense, Holmes was experiencing a psychotic break at the time of the shooting, and he didn't have the ability to understand the difference between right and wrong. One of the cornerstones of the defense's case was the testimony from mental health experts who had examined Holmes. Several psychiatrists testified that Holmes showed clear signs of schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that can cause delusions, hallucinations, and distorted thinking. These experts described how Holmes had gradually descended into madness in the months leading up to the shooting, becoming increasingly detached from reality and fixated on violent fantasies. Holmes' notebook, which he had mailed to his psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Fenton, before the attack, was a key piece of evidence for the defense. The notebook contained chilling entries about Holmes' plans for the shooting, but it also revealed the depth of his mental illness. In the notebook, Holmes wrote about his desire to kill and his belief that by doing so, he could increase his human capital. These bizarre writings, according to the defense, were evidence of a mind gripped by delusion. Holmes' defense team also pointed to his behavior after the shooting as further proof of his psychosis. So after being arrested, Holmes reportedly displayed signs of confusion and detachment, appearing unemotional and distant. He told officers that he had rigged his apartment, showed little concern of any consequences, and then in jail he exhibited bizarre behavior, including attempting to harm himself, which his defense team argued was consistent with someone suffering from severe mental illness. The defense's argument rested on the notion that while Holmes had certainly committed the crime, he did so in a state of diminished mental capacity. They asked the jury to consider whether someone as mentally ill as Holmes could truly be held accountable for such a monstrous act. By pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, the defense argued that Holmes should be institutionalized rather than executed or imprisoned. You know the prosecution would have a very different take, and they did. They painted James as a cold, calculating murderer who had carefully planned the attack for months. While they acknowledged that Holmes had a history of mental illness, they argued that his actions demonstrated a clear understanding of what he was doing and a meticulous level of planning that belied any claim of insanity. Prosecutor George Brochler led the state's case against Holmes, and his argument was straightforward. Holmes knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecutor focused on the amount of preparation that went into this massacre, presenting it as proof that Holmes had acted with premeditation and intent. According to the prosecution, Holmes had spent weeks, if not months, getting his weapons, getting everything ready. And these steps, they argued, were not the actions of someone lost in psychosis. They were the actions of someone who wanted to kill as many people as possible. They also emphasized Holmes' calm demeanor immediately after the shooting. When police arrested him in the parking lot outside the theater, Holmes did not resist. He didn't act out. He didn't display erratic behavior. Instead, he told police officers matter-of-factly that his apartment was booby-trapped and seemingly fully aware of everything he had done. To the prosecution, this was evidence Holmes understood the consequences of his actions. And one of their most powerful arguments was that Holmes had not chosen his victims at random. Instead, he had deliberately targeted the packed movie theater to maximize the number of casualties. They also brought in their own psychiatric experts who testified that while Holmes may have been mentally ill, he was not insane. Not legally insane. They argued that Holmes was capable of understanding his actions and that they were wrong, and that his decision to plan and execute the attack showed that intent and control. The heart of the argument in the James Holmes trial revolved around two main points: Holmes' mental state at the time of the shooting and the level of premeditation that went into the attack. For the defense, the argument was simple. He was too mentally ill. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Prosecution says, hey, regardless of mental health issues, the level of planning was undeniable. This was premeditation. Then, of course, you have the public reaction and media coverage. It garnered intense media attention, this trial, and public opinion was sharply divided. Some viewed Holmes as a deranged individual whose mental illness had led him to commit an unthinkable crime. Others saw him as a monster who had meticulously planned and carried out a massacre, and he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. The media often focused on Holmes' appearance in court, where he appeared disheveled and detached and emotionless. This portrayal added to the public's perception of him as a deeply disturbed individual, though opinions varied widely on whether his mental illness should mitigate his responsibility for the shooting. The case also sparked broader discussions about mental health and violence, with some arguing that more attention should be paid to identifying and treating individuals like Holmes before they commit violent acts. Others emphasize the importance of holding individuals accountable, regardless of their mental state. After months of testimony, the expert analysis, and very emotional accounts from survivors and the families of victims, the jury deliberated for over 12 hours before delivering a verdict, and they find James Holmes guilty on all counts. They reject the defense's argument of insanity. However, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether Holmes should receive the death penalty. As a result, Holmes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury's decision reflected the complex nature of the case. While they believed Holmes was guilty of the crime, they were divided on whether his mental illness warranted the ultimate punishment. But if you think about it, we take away the death penalty and now you're just in prison for your whole life. Is this an act of compassion for someone with mental illness, or is this just going to be a life of hell with regular prisoners in a world that's probably only going to make them worse, regardless of how violent they are? I mean, this case brought to light so many difficult and divisive issues, none more controversial than the question of mental illness and accountability. On one hand, Holmes was clearly a deeply disturbed individual, clearly with a well-documented history of schizophrenia and other mental health issues. But there was meticulous planning. There was an execution of this attack, and it raised serious doubts of whether he should just be absolved of this responsibility. One of the central controversies was the use of the insanity defense here. Holmes' legal team argued that his schizophrenia had rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongness of his actions, and therefore he should not be held criminally responsible. The prosecution and a large portion of the public disagreed. When we're dealing with accountability and mental health, we can have someone who is legally insane who is also a danger to the public. And that's where we start to lose our clarity on this. If you are a danger, you go to prison. If you are hurting, you get help. What is the middle ground here? And while the legal system is designed to punish those who commit these heinous crimes, it also must consider whether individuals like Holmes should be treated differently because of their mental state. As we progress in our understanding of all things, The legal world is going to end up with more challenges. We can't just have a blanketed law and consequences for things that are squishy like this. Supporters of the insanity defense here argued that Holmes' actions were a direct result of untreated mental illness. So life in prison or death would do nothing to address the root cause here. Others, they're not concerned with that. They're concerned with the sheer brutality of this attack, and they want justice. And then you have the media giving you all of the information. The public was inundated with images of Holmes, showing him in court with an expressionless, detached demeanor. His appearance in court, sometimes disheveled, brightly dyed hair, it was the focal point of the media, shaping the public's perception of him as a figure somewhere between a madman and a cold-blooded killer. So what was the public left to do? They did not have all the facts to even make a decision. Beyond the trial, the Holmes case started a national conversation about how mental health care systems handle individuals at risk, like this, of committing violent acts. The doctor, Dr. Fenton, had been aware of Holmes' violent fantasies, but no significant intervention occurred before the attack. Was James Holmes and the victims in the movie theater, had they been failed? Many advocates called for increased funding and resources for mental care health, arguing that better mental health systems could prevent similar tragedies in the future. As we come to the end of this tragic and complex case, the question remains, was James Holmes a man in the grip of a psychotic break, or was he fully aware of the horror that he was about to unleash on innocent victims with no idea, out to just have a fun time? Well, now it's your turn to decide. After hearing the facts, the arguments, and the lingering controversies, where do you stand? Can you commit? Was this a case of a man consumed by mental illness, unable to understand the gravity of his actions? Or was this a premeditated act of cold-blooded violence? As we close this chapter, consider the broader implications of this case. How should society deal with individuals like Holmes, whose mental illness intersects with violent behavior? Should the focus be on punishment or treatment? And how do we as a society balance our desire for justice with our understanding of mental health? In the case of James Holmes, the jury found him guilty on all counts, but they were divided on the issue of the death penalty, ultimately sentencing him to life in prison. For some, this was the right decision. He would never walk free again. But for others, the lack of a death sentence felt like an incomplete form of justice. Others feel like it's a failure altogether. He should be in treatment. So after hearing the details of this case, the testimonies from experts, the arguments from both sides, what do you think? Was justice served, or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay aware. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.